She came up the road on foot, in the last gray light of an October that had already turned mean, and she said the one thing I never expected to hear from a stranger's mouth. "They said you were looking for a wife." I wasn't. I'd never told a living soul such a thing. I'd buried my mother in the spring, buried the idea of company a long time before that, and I'd made my peace with the kind of quiet that settles over a man who eats standing up because there's no reason to set a second plate. But there she stood, half frozen, holding a letter with my name on it in handwriting that wasn't mine. And God help me, too tired and too lonesome and too slow to do the sensible thing, I heard myself say yes before I'd thought it through. This is the story of the lie that walked up my road, the truth I had to dig out of it, and the woman I almost let go before I understood what the cold had carried to my door. Stay with me. By the end, you'll know who really sent her, and why I'd spend the rest of my days grateful for a deception. I was out at the South Rail counting posts. I count things, always have, fence posts and fence days, and the month since I last spoke a whole sentence to another human being, when old Patch lifted his head off his paws and made a sound that wasn't quite a growl, more a question. I followed where his nose pointed, down the wagon track that came up off the county road, and there was a shape on it that didn't belong to my country. People didn't come up my road. There was nothing at the top of it but me, 80 head of cattle that weren't paying for themselves, a horse barn that listed 2 degrees off true, and a house my father built and my mother died in. Folks had no cause to climb that hill, so when I saw a figure walking it, mind you, no horse, no wagon, just a body moving against the wind with a bag in one hand, I set down my tally stick, and I watched the way you watch whether you don't trust. It took her a long while to reach me. That road is steeper than it looks, and she was carrying something heavier than the bag. I could see it in how she walked. Like every step was an argument she was barely winning. When she got close enough that I could make out a face, I saw a woman maybe 30, maybe a hard-used 25, with a coat too thin for the season buttoned up to her chin, and a hat that had given up holding its shape. Her boots were good boots once. They weren't good boots anymore. There was road dust ground into the creases of her knuckles, and a kind of blankness in her eyes that I'd only ever seen on men coming back from a long drive. That look of a person who has gone past tired into someplace tired can't follow. She stopped about 10 feet off. We regarded each other across that distance the way 2 animals do when neither one is sure which is the danger. "Are you Wade Tanner?" she said. Her voice came out cracked from cold and disuse. "I am." She set the bag down then, slow, like setting down a baby, and she reached into her coat with fingers that shook from cold, I thought, though it was more than cold, and she brought out a folded paper, much handled, the creases gone soft as cloth. "They said you were looking for a wife," she said. I have turned that moment over in my hands more times than I can count, and I still don't know what my face did. I know what my chest did. It dropped. The way the floor of a stomach drops when a horse stumbles under you, because I had said no such thing. Not to the marriage broker in Helena, not to the church ladies who'd circled me like patient hawks since mother passed, not to Sam Pell who knew me better than my own reflection. I'd never said it because I'd never believed it of myself, that I was the kind of man a woman would board a train for. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "I think there's been a mistake." I watched the word mistake land on her. It didn't knock her down. It was worse than that. She just absorbed it, the way ground absorbs a thing that's fallen too many times to make a sound anymore. Her jaw set. Her chin came up half an inch pride, the last thing the broke and the beaten will sell, and she held the letter out toward me. "Is this your name?" I took it. My hands aren't shy of paper, I keep ledgers, I write a fair hand. But I almost couldn't make my eyes work on what I was reading. It was a letter to a Miss Ada Brennan, care of a boarding establishment in St. Paul, Minnesota. It described a man of good standing in the Montana Territory, a rancher, a Christian, a quiet man and one of a wife to share a settled life. It promised passage paid as far as Helena. It was signed, in a confident slanting hand that was nothing at all like my cramped one, Wade Tanner. The lamp of understanding doesn't always come on all at once. Sometimes it gutters. I stood there in the wind reading my own name written by a hand that wasn't mine, and the cold went all the way through me in a manner that had nothing to do with the weather. Someone had done this. Someone had reached into my life and offered up the one thing I'd never had the courage to want, and then they'd sent the bill straight to my front gate, walking in October. "This isn't my writing," I said. "The truth of it sat between us, useless. I never wrote this. I never sent for I didn't send for anybody." And here is the part I think about most. She didn't beg. She didn't weep, though I could see the weeping standing right behind her eyes like a horse behind a gate. She just looked at me, and then she looked past me at the house with smoke coming off the chimney, at the warm yellow square of the window, and she looked back the way she'd come, down that long mean road, into the dark that was already pooling up out of the draws. And she did a sum in her head. I could see her do it. The distance back. The money she didn't have. The night coming on at 20-some degrees. "I see," she said, 2 words. She bent and picked up her bag again. "I'm sorry to have troubled you, Mr. Tanner. If you could point me back toward the road into town, I'll trouble you no further." It was 11 miles to town. I have heard preachers say that a man's whole life can pivot on a single choice, and I used to think that was the kind of thing preachers say, because it sounds fine on a Sunday. I don't think that anymore, because I stood there with a forgery in my hand and a stranger turning to walk 11 miles in the dark, and I felt my whole life lean, the way a loaded wagon leans before it goes over. "It's 11 miles," I said, "and it's coming on to freeze tonight." She stopped, her back to me. "There's stew on the stove," I said. The words came out of me like they belonged to somebody braver. "It's not much. My mother's pot. You can have a hot supper in the spare room, and in the morning when it's light, I'll hitch the wagon and drive you to town myself, and we'll sort out who did this to the both of us." I swallowed. That's the only thing I've got to offer that an honest woman could take. She turned around, and the look on her face, I'd give a good deal to forget it and a good deal more to remember it true. It was a look that had stopped expecting kindness, meeting kindness, and not knowing what to do with its hands. "Why," she said, not even a question really, "you don't know me." "No, ma'am." I could be anybody, a thief, worse. "You could," I agreed. "You'd be a thief who walked 11 miles uphill to rob a man with 80 unpaid-for cows and a barn falling down. I'd say the odds are you're just cold." Something happened at the corner of her mouth then. Not a smile. The ghost of where a smile used to live before it moved out. And she came back up the road, and that is how Ada Brennan came to sit at my mother's table on the first night, with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee like it was the only warm thing left in the world, which for all I knew it was. I'll tell you about the house, so you understand the quiet I'm describing. My father built it in '61 before he went off and got himself killed at a place I won't name, and my mother kept it and kept me, and the 2 of us rattled around in it like the last 2 beans in a can for 30-odd years until the consumption took her that April. After that it was just me and Patch and the stove and the ticking of my father's pocket watch, which has been broken since I was a boy and which I wind every night anyway. I couldn't tell you why. It doesn't keep time. But a man gets to a point where the winding is the point, where the small ritual is the only conversation he's having, and you wind a dead watch every night the way some men say grace over an empty plate, because the saying is what keeps you a person. That's the man Ada Brennan walked in on. A man who wound a broken watch and talked to his dog and counted fence posts so he'd have numbers in his head instead of the other thing. She ate like a person who'd learned not to trust the next meal, fast at first, then catching herself, slowing down, ashamed of the fast. I pretended not to notice. I fed Patch a scrap by the stove and gave her room to be hungry without an audience. "You came from St. Paul," I said, when she'd finished and was holding the coffee. "From there last, from other places before." She turned the cup. I worked in a hotel, laundry mostly, then the kitchen. A pause that had a whole history folded up inside it. Then I didn't. And the letter. She set the cup down very precisely, lining it up with a knot in the wood like the placement mattered. A man named Mr. Hollies runs an introduction service out of an office above a dry goods store. You write your particulars on a card. He matches them against the cards that come in from out west from men like you, lonely men with land and no wives. She glanced up at me quick to see if lonely had stung. I let it not sting. He showed me the letter, your letter. He said the passage was paid as far as Helena and that you were a decent sort. I had $11 and a room I couldn't keep past the month, so I came. $11. It's gone now, she said simply. The train, the stage to where the stage stopped, a meal yesterday, a bed the night before, the walk this morning was free. That ghost again at the mouth. I'm a thorough kind of broke, Mr. Tanner. You don't have to worry I'm hiding a fortune. I laughed before I knew I was going to. It surprised the both of us. It had been a long while since a laugh had come up out of me without being dragged. Wade, I said, if you're going to sleep under my mother's quilt, you might as well call me Wade. She studied me a moment. Ada, she said, as if we hadn't both already known. I gave her the spare room, my mother's old room, which I'd left exactly as it was because I hadn't the heart to make it not hers, and I lay awake a long time in mine listening to the wind work at the eaves and the small foreign sounds of another person in the house. A floorboard, a cough, the settle of someone lying down who is afraid to fully lie down. And I thought about the letter. Because here is the thing that kept me from sleep, and it wasn't the woman, not entirely. It was the handwriting, that confident slant. I'd seen it before. I knew I had. It worried at me the way a name will sit just behind your teeth and refuse to come. I went down through everyone I knew who could write a clean hand and had reason to know my particulars, that I had land, that I was alone, that my mother had passed and left me rattling, and the list was short, painfully short. That's the cost of the kind of life I'd led. When you finally need to know who in the world cares enough about you to forge your name to a marriage letter, you find you can count them on the fingers of one hand and have fingers to spare. But there was one, there was Sam. Sam Pell, who'd homesteaded the next valley over the same spring my father did, who taught me to throw a rope and to take a drink and later not to, who'd stood beside me at my mother's grave with his hat in his ruined hands, and said the only true thing anybody said that day, which was, Wade, you can't keep on being the last one left in a house. It'll eat you. Sam, whose hand I'd seen on 100 bills of sale and brand registrations, and the one letter he ever sent me, years back, that I'd kept for no reason I could name. Sam, who hadn't been off his place in 2 months because the thing in his chest had finally won the long argument it had been having with him, and who I'd been meaning to ride over and see, and who I'd been not riding over to see because I am, at bottom, a coward about the people I love dying, having gotten so much practice at it. I lay there in the dark and I knew, the way you know a storm's coming by the smell before the clouds even up. Sam wrote that letter. Sam, dying, had reached out of his own ending and tried to fix the one thing about my life that had always grieved him. But I didn't know, no. Not yet. So I told myself I'd ride over and ask him, soon as I'd driven Ada to town, and I'd put the question to him plain, and we'd have a laugh about it, the meddling old fool, before whatever came next for Sam came. I never did get to put it to him the way I planned. The morning had other ideas. I woke before light to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of my own stove being worked by hands that weren't mine, and for one cracked-open moment, half asleep, I thought it was Mother, and the grief of it being not, Mother went through me clean as a blade. Then I remembered. Ada. I came down to find her dressed, hair pinned up, the kitchen warmer and brighter than it had been since spring. She'd found the bacon and the meal and the last of the eggs, and she'd made breakfast, not asking, not waiting to be told, just doing the thing that needed doing because she was the kind of person who, dropped into a strange kitchen with nothing to her name, said about being useful before she said about being grateful. You didn't have to, I said. I did, though. She didn't look up from the skillet. It's the only coin I've got. You'll let me pay my way to town in eggs, Mr. Tanner. Wade. She corrected herself like she was practicing the name. We ate. It was a strange, easy meal, strange because she was a stranger, easy because some people you just fit alongside, like two stones, the rivers already worked into shapes that leaned together. I told her about the cattle. She told me a little about St. Paul, the bad parts edited out, though the edges of the bad parts showed. And then we put on our coats to go hitch the wagon for the long, cold drive that was going to deliver her back to a town where she knew no one and had nothing. We stepped out onto the porch, and there, coming up my road that nobody came up, was a horse at a hard run, lathered, ridden by Sam Pell's boy Tobias, his face a white smear of news. I knew before he reined up. You always know. "Pa's bad, Mr. Tanner," the boy got out, his horse blowing. "He's asking for you. He says," the boy's voice broke and reformed, "he says to come quick and to bring her." Bring her. I felt Ada go still beside me. I felt her understand, in the same heartbeat I did, that the man who'd written my name on her future was lying 2 valleys over with his time running out, and that he'd known, somehow, in his ruined certainty, that she'd already be standing on my porch when his boy came. I looked at her. She looked at me. And neither one of us said the thing we were both thinking, which was that this was no longer a mistake to be sorted out by lamplight and a wagon ride. It was something that had been set in motion, and the man who'd set it was about to be beyond all our asking. "Hitch the wagon," I told Tobias. "She's coming." Sam Pell was dying in the front room of his own house, in the bed his sons had carried down from upstairs so he wouldn't have to spend his last strength on a staircase. And the smell when we came in, that close, Swedish, laboring smell of a body finishing its work, took me straight back to my mother's room and nearly buckled my knees in the doorway. His wife had passed 2 winters back. His grown daughters were married off to far valleys and wouldn't make it in time, and they all knew it, which is its own kind of grief. So it was just the 2 boys, Tobias and the younger one, and a neighbor woman come to do what the women do, and now me, and Ada hanging back at the threshold with her hat in her hands, not knowing if she had the right to come further in. "Wade," Sam's voice was a thread, but his eyes were still all Sam, sharp and amused and unrepentant, glittering up out of a face that had gone to paper. "You took your damn time. You knew I would." I went to the chair by the bed. My hat was in my hands too, I realized. We Montana men, we love each other with our hats off and our mouths shut, and it costs us. "You knew I'd put it off, coward that I am." "Coward." He breathed the word out like it amused him. "You walked into a burning lean-to and pulled my Tobias out by his ankle when he was 9, and the smoke had me on my knees. Don't coward me, Wade Tanner." His eyes moved past me to the doorway, to Ada, and something came into his ruined face that I can only call triumph. The cat that got into the cream and doesn't regret it even with the door coming open. "She came," he said, not to me, to himself, to whatever ledger he was settling. "I wasn't sure she'd come, but she came." There it was, the confession offered up gladly, no shame in it at all. "It was you," I said, not even angry. I couldn't find the anger, it was buried under too much else. "The letter, you wrote it. You signed my name and you sent it off to St. Paul." "I did." He didn't even pretend. "Got the particulars from Holly's circular. They run in the Helena paper. The introduction services, you know that if you ever read past the cattle prices. I wrote up what was true about you and left out what's only sad about you, and I signed your name, and I paid the passage out of the money I sure as hell wasn't going to need." A cough took him, a long bad one, and Tobias started forward and Sam waved him off with 2 fingers. When he could speak again, his voice was smaller but no less certain. "I've watched you bury everybody, Wade. Your pa, your ma. You're 40 years old and you wind a dead watch and you talk to a dog. I couldn't go and leave you to it. I couldn't be one more grave you stand over alone. His eyes found mine and held. So I sent you a living person instead of leaving you another dead one. Sue me. I want you to understand what that is. A dying man, with the few weeks he had left, spending them not on his own peace but on engineering yours. Reaching out past the edge of his own life to leave you something he was sure you'd never reach for yourself. It is the most arrogant, presumptuous, interfering thing a person can do. It is also the largest thing I have ever had done for me, and I knew it even kneeling there furious and grieving, with no idea yet how to hold it. You can't just, I started. I can, Sam said. I'm dying. It's about the only thing left I can do. And then, gentler, the amusement falling away to leave something underneath it that I'd known was there for 40 years but had never seen this naked. You saved my boy, Wade. You saved my whole self in that blizzard in '79 when I'd have laid down and frozen and been glad to. I've owed you the whole back half of my life, and I never had a way to pay it. His gaze went again to the doorway, to the woman standing there with tears running plain down her face for a man she'd never met until this hour. So I'm paying you, in the only coin that ever mattered. I'm paying you back in company. Don't you dare give it away out of pride. You hear me? Don't you dare. I couldn't answer him. There wasn't any answer to make. Ada came forward then. I don't know what moved her, only that she crossed the room and knelt on the other side of the bed and took Sam Pell's paper hand in both of hers. This stranger, this woman a lie had carried across half a continent, and she said the only thing that needed saying. Thank you for the letter, Mr. Pell, whatever comes of it. Nobody's tried to do me a kindness in a long, long time. I won't forget that you were the one who did. And Sam Pell smiled at her like she'd handed him the deed to heaven and closed his eyes, and that was very nearly the last good moment he had. He went 2 days later in the night, easy at the end, the boys with him. We buried him beside his wife on the rise behind his house with the whole valley turning out, because a man like Sam, who'd had his hand in everybody's barn raising and calving and grief for 30 years, does not go into the ground unwitnessed. Ada stood beside me at the grave. I want to be plain about how strange that was and how it wasn't strange at all. For days I'd known her, for days. And she stood at my elbow at my oldest friend's burial like she'd always been there, and when my throat closed up and wouldn't open she put her hand against my back, just for a moment, just enough, and took it away before anyone could make a thing of it. A small mercy delivered private. She was full of those. I was only beginning to learn it. We didn't talk about the town anymore. The wagon ride to deliver her back never happened. It would have felt, after Sam, like throwing away a gift on the very day of the funeral of the man who gave it. So she stayed in my mother's room, and the days started to fill themselves the way water finds the low places. She mended things. The house was full of broken small things I'd stopped seeing: a chair with a wobble, a window that whistled, a quilt coming apart at the binding, and she fixed them one by one, not making a show of it, just leaving the world a little more whole behind her as she moved through it. She cooked. She learned the chickens' names and then the horses, and then, to my private astonishment, the names of the cows, which I'd never bothered with because 80 is a lot of names and I'd had no one to say them to. I taught her to drive the wagon, to set a snare, to read the weather off the way the magpies sat. She taught me, without ever once setting out to teach me anything, how to be in a room with another person again, how to eat sitting down, how to say a whole sentence about how a day had been, and then another one, until the sentences strung together into the thing I'd lost the trick of, which was talking, which is just loneliness with the lid off. I told her about my mother. She told me in pieces over weeks, with long gaps where the telling cost too much, about her own life. And here is where the easy part of this story ends, because not all of what she told me was easy, and one piece of it she did not tell me at all. I had to find it out the hard way. It came out a little at a time, the truth of Ada Brennan. She was a widow. Her husband, a man named Calloway, had died of a fever in a railroad camp 3 years back, and that I'd known in outline. What she hadn't said What came out one November evening when I'd asked an idle question about why she'd left St. Paul in such a hurry that she'd walk uphill 11 miles rather than wait for a wagon, was the shape of what she'd been running from. Calloway had a brother, Royce, and when Calloway died owing money gambling debts, the kind that follow a name even into the grave, Royce Calloway had stepped in and paid them, not out of kindness. Royce Calloway didn't have the equipment for kindness. He paid them so that he could own them, so that he could turn to his dead brother's widow and explain to her, in the patient voice of a man laying out arithmetic, that she now owed him, and that the debt would be worked off in his household under his roof, for as long as it took, which by his arithmetic would be the rest of her natural life. She'd worked in that house 11 months. She didn't tell me everything that happened in those 11 months. She told me enough. She told me about the day she understood the debt wasn't a debt, it was a cage with a number painted on the door, and the day she decided she would rather starve free than eat full in that house. And she told me how she'd run, taken what little was hers and run, 2 states, 3 towns, the laundry, the hotel kitchen, always moving, always one ledger line ahead of a man who, she was certain, considered her property that had walked off and meant to get it back. "That's why I answered the letter," she said. "We were at the table. The lamp was low. Her hands were flat on the wood, very still, the way a person holds still over something that might still go off. A man in Montana wanting a quiet wife. A whole territory between me and St. Paul. I'd have answered a letter from the devil himself if it had a far enough postmark." She looked up at me and her eyes were steady, but her chin had that lift to it, the pride, the last thing the hunted will sell. "I let you go on thinking I was just a poor woman a service matched up with you. I let you think the worst of it was that I was broke. I should have told you the first night that there might be a man coming after me, that if he found out where I'd gone he might come here." She drew a breath that shook. "I put you in a thing without telling you the size of it. That's not honest. You took me in out of kindness and I paid it back by hiding what could land on your doorstep. So," she squared herself, "if you want to drive me to town now, Wade, I'll go. I'll understand it. I've got no right to your trouble." And there it was, the heavy choice laid down on my mother's table between the lamp and the salt. Because she was right that it was a risk. A man like Royce Calloway, with money and a grievance and a long memory, that's a real thing to bring onto a place. And I'm not a fighting man. I'm a man who counts fence posts. I could drive her to town in the morning, put her on a stage, and the trouble she carried would go on down the road and leave my 80 cows and my falling down barn in the peace they'd always had. I looked at her hands flat on the table. I thought about Sam, 2 valleys over in the cold ground, who'd spent his dying breath telling me not to give this away out of pride. I thought he didn't send me a woman with no troubles. There's no such woman. He sent me a person. People come with the size of their lives attached. That's the whole of what loving anybody is, taking the size of them on. "Ada," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "When you walked up my road that first night, you'd already done the bravest thing I ever heard of. You walked away from a roof and a full plate and a number painted on a door into the cold. With $11 because you'd rather be free and afraid than safe and owned." I reached across the table and put my hand over both of hers, the first time I'd touched her on purpose, and I felt her go still as a held breath. "I'm not driving you to town. If Royce Calloway wants to come up my road, he can come up my road. It's 11 miles uphill. By the time he gets to the top, he'll be in no shape for arithmetic." The ghost smile came. And then, for the first time since she'd walked into my life, the smile finished itself, all the way, lit her whole tired face, and right behind it the tears came, the ones that had been standing behind the gate for weeks, and she let them. And I came around the table and she stood up into me and we held onto each other in the lamplight like 2 people who'd each been the last one in their own house for too long and had just been told they didn't have to be anymore. We didn't speak of marriage. The letter had used that word and the word had walked her to my door, but we'd let it lie unspoken between us all these weeks because neither of us trusted a thing that had begun in a forgery. But standing there, I understood that the lie had become the truest thing in my life, and that I would marry this woman, and that I'd find a circuit preacher or a justice or a willing fool with a Bible, and I'd do it proper. I had it all planned. The next clear day, I'd ride into town and post the banns and see about a ring. The next clear day, a stranger was waiting for me on the road into town. A well-dressed man on a good horse, with two hard cases riding behind him, asking the storekeeper a question I could hear from across the street. He was asking whether anybody'd seen a woman, dark hair, about 30. Calloway, he said, though she might be calling herself something else by now. Royce Calloway had come up the long road after all. I have turned this over too, and I'm still not easy with it, but I'll tell it true. I stood across that muddy street and I watched Royce Calloway describe my Ada to the storekeeper, and the first thing I did was not the brave thing. The first thing I did was think about lying, about riding home and saying nothing and just being ready, keeping her close to the house, keeping the rifle loaded by the door, hopping the trail when cold. Because I just learned, standing there, exactly how much I had to lose, and a man learns the size of his cowardice in the same instant he learns the size of his love. They come in together, same door. But I'd been the man who said nothing for 40 years. I'd been the man who didn't ride over to see Sam because seeing him meant facing the ending. And I'd watched where that road went. It went to a house with one plate and a dead watch and a dog for a confidant. So I didn't ride home and lie. I rode home and told her. She took it the way she took everything hard, still, first, absorbing it the way the ground takes the fallen thing. Then she went very pale, and then, terribly, she started to nod, like a woman agreeing with a verdict she'd always known was coming. "I'll go tonight," she said, "before he finds the road up. If I'm gone, he's got no reason to trouble you. He doesn't want you, Wade, he wants," her voice failed and came back. "He wants the thing he paid for. If the thing's not here, he'll move on down the line." She was already reaching for her bag, the same bag she'd set down so careful that first night, and the sight of her packing it to walk back into the cold near tore me in half. "Ada." "It's the right thing." She wasn't looking at me. "Couldn't I think? You took me in. You don't get a man like Royce on your land for it. That's not a fair trade, Wade. You gave me 4 good months and a roof, and you taught me the cows' names." Her hands were shaking on the bag's clasp. 4 months is more than I thought I'd get. I'll take 4 months. Let me go before he comes, and I'll take 4 months and be grateful the rest of my life. And this was the heavy choice all over again, except now it wore her face and her terrible decency. And the easy thing and the kind-seeming thing had switched places with the right thing so completely, I had to stand still a moment to find which was which. Because letting her go would look like protecting her. It would even protect me. It would send the trouble back down the road. And it would be the exact same sin I'd committed my whole life, dressed up in nobility. It would be choosing the quiet house over the costly person. "No," I said. "Wade." "No." I crossed to her and I took the bag out of her hands and set it down slow, careful, the way she'd set it down that first night, and I saw her notice that I'd done it her way, and something cracked open behind her eyes. "Sam Pell spent the last good breath in his body telling me not to give you away out of pride. And what is this, Ada? What is you walking back into the cold to save me from a fight I'm willing to have? It's pride. It's the prettiest pride I ever saw, but it's pride, and I'm done giving things away. I gave away my own life one quiet evening at a time for 40 years. I am not giving away yours." My voice broke and I let it. "You don't run anymore. Not from him, not from me. The running's over, Ada. Whatever comes up that road, it finds the both of us at the top of it, together. That's the whole of what I've got to offer, and it's a damn sight more than I had to offer Sam's letter." She didn't run, she stayed. God help her, she stayed. Royce Calloway came up my road 2 days later in the early afternoon, with the light flat and gray and the first true snow of the year sifting down. And he came the way men like him always come, confident, unhurried, certain the arithmetic was on his side. I was waiting on the porch. I'd thought hard about how to be waiting. A man in my position is tempted toward the rifle, toward the dramatic, toward the version of this that ends in powder smoke. But I'm not that man, and trying to be him would have gotten me killed by his two hard cases, who were the kind of men who do that for a living and would have welcomed an excuse. So I waited on my porch with my hands empty and Patch beside me and Ada inside the house, but not hidden. That was her insistence. And she was right. And I let Royce Calloway ride all the way up the 11 miles of my road to find a quiet man standing in the snow declining to be afraid. "You'd be Tanner," he said. He didn't get down. Looking down at a man is part of the arithmetic. "I would. I believe you're harboring my brother's widow. There's a matter of a debt." He said it like reading a price off a ledger. "I've come to collect what's owed. I'm a reasonable man. I'll cover your inconvenience." And here is where the story turns on the thing I never could have planned. The thing Sam set in motion and never lived to see pay out. The kindness repaid coming round by a road none of us could have drawn. Because the 11 miles of my road run past the foot of Sam Pell's valley. And Royce Calloway, riding up, asking directions of every soul he passed, had asked them of Tobias Pell, who was mending fence at the bottom of that road. And Tobias Pell, 9 years old when I dragged him out of the smoke by his ankle, grown now and grieving, and Sam Pell's son to the marrow, had heard a hard man asking after a woman who'd held his dying father's hand and thanked him for a kindness. And Tobias had given Royce Calloway perfect, courteous directions up my road. And then Tobias had ridden the back way, the way he'd known since he was a boy, the shepherd's track over the ridge, and he'd raised the valley. So when Royce Calloway looked down at me from his good horse and offered to cover my inconvenience, what he didn't see, what he couldn't see, with the snow coming and his attention all on the arithmetic, was that the road behind him had filled up. Quiet. The way Montana men do a thing. There was Tobias and his brother. There were the Hendersons from the next place and the 2 Olland boys and old Prout who'd been at Sam's burial and a dozen more. Men I'd raised barns with and pulled calves with and stood beside at too many graves. Men I'd never once thought to ask for anything because I was a man who didn't ask. Sitting their horses in a loose, quiet line across the bottom of my road. Hats down against the snow, not saying a word. Not a gun drawn. That's the part I hold on to. Not one. They didn't need them. They just were there, the whole valley, arranged across the only road down, a wall of patient witnesses, and the message of them was older than guns and plainer. This one's ours. You'll not take anything off this hill. Royce Calloway looked behind him. I watched the arithmetic fail in his face. He'd come with money and 2 hard men and a grievance, calculating against one lonely rancher, and he'd ridden up into a thing he had no figures for, a man who'd quit being lonely. Propped up by a valley that pays its debts. "There's no debt here, Mr. Calloway," I said, and my voice was steady now all the way because I wasn't standing alone and would never have to again. "Whatever your brother owed, he owed. It died with him. The woman in that house owes you nothing but the 11 months of her life you already stole, and you'll not get a day more. You can ride down my road the way you came up it. The road's about the only thing on this place I'll give you for free." He sat his horse a long moment in the falling snow. A man like that doesn't surrender. He recalculates. And I watched him add it up, the witnesses, the distance to anywhere, the impossibility of dragging a screaming woman past 20 silent men who'd known her 4 months and known me 40 years. And I watched him reach the only sum that didn't end with him in a shallow grave in a far territory where no one would ever come asking. He turned his horse. He and his 2 hard cases rode down through the line of my neighbors, who parted just enough to let them through and not 1 inch more, and the valley watched them all the way down the 11 miles, and that was the last any of us ever saw of Royce Calloway. I married Ada Brennan in the spring, when the road had thawed and a circuit preacher came through. Tobias Pell stood up beside me where his father would have stood. We were married under the cottonwood by the house, and afterward the whole valley came up the road nobody used to climb, with food and fiddles, and my mother's house was so full of people and noise and lamplight that I had to step out onto the porch a minute, just to take the size of it. Ada found me there. She always could find me. She stood beside me in the spring dark with the party loud behind us and the cottonwood going to leaf and Sam Pell's grave 2 valleys over with new grass on it. And she didn't say anything for a while, because she'd taught me by then that the best things get said with the mouth shut. I had my father's watch in my pocket, the broken one. I'd carried it out of habit, the way I'd wound it every night of my solitary life. And standing there I took it out and looked at it. The dead hand stopped at the hour they'd stopped at when I was a boy, and I understood I didn't need to wind it anymore. There was a clock in the house now. There were the cows with their names and the chickens with theirs and a woman who knew them all. There was time in my life again, the real kind, the kind that moves. I thought about throwing the watch in the river. I didn't. Some things you keep even after they've stopped doing what they were for, because the keeping is its own kind of grace. I put it back in my pocket. I'd give it to a son, maybe, someday, and tell him it doesn't keep time and never did, and that I wound it every night anyway through the long years before his mother walked up the road, and that the winding kept me a person until the person could be saved. "What are you thinking about?" Ada said. Not really a question. She knew the shape of my quiets by then. I thought about how to say it. About Sam, dying, signing my name to a stranger's future because he loved me too well to leave me to the dead watch. About a forged letter that turned out to be the truest thing anyone ever wrote me. About a debt that came up my road meaning to collect and met a valley that had quietly decided the account was already settled, in full, in the only coin that counts. I thought they said I was looking for a wife. I wasn't. I'd given up the asking, so a dying man asked for me, and the cold carried her up my road, and I almost let her walk back down it twice out of the same pride that had cost me everything else. I put my arm around her. The party roared warm behind us. The cottonwood whispered. "I'm thinking," I started to say. But she'd already leaned her head against my shoulder, and the words didn't seem worth the trouble of finishing, so I let them go.